Great. Thank you. Well, oh, thank you. Thank you all for coming. Uh, this has been, I guess, a little bit fun putting this together. I've given a talk similar to this, I guess, 10, 15 years ago, which is why, in part, I picked this particular topic. What we're going to look at is a comparison and contrast of the Darwinian view of human history versus a biblical view of human history. We're going to keep at a higher, more general level of genetics, but we'll get into a little bit of the details. And so I hope you'll get something good out of this talk. Oh, the title of the talk, One Human Family. I'm really basing at least the first part of the talk out of a book by Dr. Carl Weiland, who I forgot his origins now. He's with one of the creation groups and wrote a book in probably 2010 or so. It might even be in my notes. 2011. CMI, there we go, Creation Ministries International. Very good, thank you. But really where I'm coming from is Acts 17:26. He made from one blood every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined their appointed times and boundaries of their habitation. And I highlighted one blood because really we're one human family. We talk about races based upon outward appearances, but it really is something that's just skin deep. Most of our genetic makeup is nearly identical across the whole globe, no matter where you're from on the earth. One of the recent figures I saw in doing this research, I have not tried to verify this, they were saying 99.9% of our genetic material is identical, whether you're from whatever, Ohio or Beijing, China, or the southern tip of South America, wherever you are on the planet. Darwin's view of the races, okay, his title of his book, we shorten it to Origin of Species, Origin of the Species, but here's the full title, The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. And I think what goes unnoticed is the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. So there's this whole notion of, I guess, differences between human populations that was in circulation at the time. And Darwin just really took that and it kind of took off like a rocket over the next few decades. And we're going to look at some of the results of that. But to put this in context too, Darwin really wasn't the first to come up with the whole idea of natural selection. His grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, which was the late 1700s, wrote some things on it. There was actually a creationist fellow in the early 1800s. I'm going to need to look at my notes on this one. Blythe, I think. There we go. Edward Blythe had detailed writings on natural selection, maybe one of the most pronounced prior to Darwin, but he wasn't recognized for it. And one, he was a creationist, and he thought that natural selection basically gave you variation within species, but it didn't lead to like monkeys turning to apes, turning to people, or that kind of macroevolutionary type of change that we see. But Darwin, on the other hand, took it all the way, and really, if you read The Origin of the Species, he constantly mixed what I would refer to as microevolution, which was what Blythe was talking about, versus this macroevolution, that there's a common ancestor and your relatives, your ancestors are monkeys and apes. I kept this slide in here. Like I said, I did a talk on this kind of topic, but I kept it in from about 15 years ago, sorry, just because this has changed quite a bit. More, whoops, I hit the wrong button, more up in this area as far as how far back our ancestors go, and this is more stable. And I think some of it has got to do with how evolutionary people have interpreted some of the data that we're going to look at in a little bit, as well as other archaeological kinds of finds. But this is a more recent view of it from the past year or so, but it still shows there was a common ancestor, some primate ancestor, gorillas, monkeys, and then hominids, Ardipithecus, Australopithecus, and then actual humans arising 2 to 3 million years ago. We're not going to really focus so much on this. We're going to focus more on the more recent history, the past, quote, couple 100,000 years or less as we go through this. Here's a quote from Darwin, his Voyage of the Beagle. This was a quote from this book, and this is in response to seeing some of the native people at the southern tip of South America, Terra del Fuego. I'm saying that correctly. I could not have believed how wide was the difference between savage and civilized man. It is greater than between a wild and domesticated animal. Viewing such men, one can hardly make oneself believe that they are fellow creatures and inhabitants of the same world. It is a common subject of conjecture what pleasures in life some of the lower animals can enjoy. How much more reasonably the same question may be asked of these barbarians. So you can see the attitude there that Darwin was reflecting, and he wasn't the only person thinking like this. There was thought like this in culture and society at the time. He just more vocalized it, what happened. There we go. So these ideas, Darwin's book, this was 1845 when this was written, his actual Origin of Species, came out in 1859. And over the decades after that, it really caught on, and people responded to it, especially the scientific community. This is a picture of Otto Benga. He was an African pygmy, I think from the Belgian Congo at the time. This is early 1900s. And they brought him over to the United States and put him on display in the Brooklyn Zoo. Yeah, it's pretty bad. Now, I guess on the positive side, he didn't like live in a cage in the zoo. It was his job. And he had an apartment, and they provided for his whatever food and shelter. But his job was to be a display of this is the evolutionary sequence, and this is an example of the lower life forms from an earlier common ancestor. Oh, I think it might get worse. I don't know. Anyhow, this is from a New York Times editorial in 1906. The pygmies are very low in the human scale, and the suggestion that Benga should be in a school instead of a cage ignores the high probability that school would be a place from which he could draw no advantage whatever. The idea that men are all much alike, except as they have had or lacked opportunities for getting an education out of books, is now far out of date. So again, it's feeding into this whole idea that there's, apes and monkeys in our ancestry, and the people with darker skin are more closely related to those apes and monkeys than us, and they should be actually objects of study. Yep, yep. Well, it got worse going to Australia. Uh, this is a quote from an article in the region from, I guess, '04, but really out of this book that went and studied the history from 1697 to 1973. And again, these ideas were there. They were actually capturing the Aborigine people of Australia and shipping them to different places. I think they were actually like killing them, taking scalps or skulls and stuff and selling them to the different museums, because here's a scientific piece to put on display in your museum. And so this is a historical look back. This is '04, what this is coming from, but it's been estimated that the remains of some 50,000 Aborigines are housed in medical and scientific institutions abroad. The Tasmanian Aboriginal remains in particular are there for two reasons. First, at the time of collection, they were considered to be the most primitive link in the evolutionary chain and therefore worthy of scientific consideration. Second, each skull fetched between 5 and 10 shillings, which I don't know what that translates into in today's money, but the phrase follow the money, there's another example of that. So yeah, it's sad, but ideas do have consequences. And of course, you don't hear this kind of history unless you're going to be digging into it and looking for it. Where are we going? The other piece to this is you could ask the question, where was the church? Where were the people of God standing up to this? I mean, we're all created equal, like our Constitution says, created in the image of God. What's that? Yeah, like the Bible says, right? But one of these quotes, I think this is from, I don't have the quote here. This is from the textbook, One Human Blood. And I think it's his kind of commentary. I'm not showing it because I want to give a couple other comments. Just to kind of put it in perspective here, the historical context, during the time of the Renaissance, that's the 14th century to the 17th century, you have a rediscovery of the classics, like the Roman and Greek literature. That kind of stuff has been going on the past few hundred years. But it's also the birth of humanism coming out of that time frame. But the names of people, I guess I wanted to name drop here. That's why I'm pausing a little bit, because they're all well-known household names. Da Vinci, Shakespeare, Luther, Galileo, Boyle, Newton, Magellan, Columbus, Coronado. The last three, though, are part of the explorers coming from Europe over to the Americas. Of course, they're discovering people groups, but they view them as uncivilized savages, kind of like Darwin was saying. So this stuff has been percolating through human society across the globe for really a couple hundred years before we get to this point in time. So that's the historical context I guess I wanted to bring. So during both the Renaissance and the following time period, the Enlightenment, which would have been part of where Darwin was living through, many in the churches favored whatever the prevailing view was in the wider society, over and above the biblical account. The widespread acquiescence of religious folk to Darwinism in the 19th century thus had ample precedent. It was, in fact, mostly scientists that held out against this tide, not churchians. And that's a quote from Weiland from just his research and what he found as far as what was going on historically, which I think is something for us to take note of. Well, of course, there is the biblical view of the races. which is much different than the Darwinian evolutionary view, this macroevolutionary view. So we have, of course, the creation, Adam and Eve being real people that lived and breathed, lived, 900 years is what's recorded in the Bible. There was the flood, and then Noah and his family basically repopulated the earth, and then the Babel dispersion. So if that stuff really did happen, we should see some evidence for it in the genetic markers that people are looking at to support the evolutionary side. And we'll get into some of this stuff as we go through it. So we're going to look at a little bit at genetic variations. This is just a quick overview, kind of a reminder maybe, hopefully. Here's your cell. You got the nucleus of the cell. That's where your DNA material is held. We've got our 46 chromosomes, 23 pairs, 23 from the mother, 23 from the father. I marked a couple spots out because we're going to use that, and then this is just showing the unraveling of the genes, which have all of the DNA, and the DNA has all the information that's coded for your proteins and the other, I guess, machinery that's needed for building us. What I want to focus on, I guess maybe I'll do this on the next slide, is want to look at skin tone. I'm going to use skin tone versus skin color because I think it's more appropriate. In fact, I did bring a demo for that. So this is actually an iridium compound dissolved in water, but you can, it's the same material, it's just been diluted. So the first one is, I guess, the concentrate with the highest concentration of it, and then a 10x is in the middle, and then a 100x is on your right, if I have that correct. It's all the same material. It's not all the same color because of the different concentrations. And we have the same thing going on with our skin tones. If you have more melanin formation, you have darker skin tone. And if you have lighter or less melanin formation, you have a lighter skin tone. So, of course, this is driven by genetics. We're going to oversimplify it just to illustrate the principle. So we're just going to use two genes. There seems to be at least 4 or 5 that are really involved, and a recent study was suggesting there's up to 169 other genes that have factors in determining your final skin tone. So it actually is quite complex. But breaking it down to 2 genes on 2 spots with the mother and father each contributing, we can, I think, get a nice picture of things, or a simple, an easy to understand picture of this. So the capital solid bold M is going to represent high levels of melanin. And so we could say a black gene, black in quotes, would be the father having the gene, whoops, I hit the wrong button. The gene that codes for high levels of melanin in both spots. And you'd have that from the mother and from the father. You could go the other way. A white gene combination would be having the low levels of melanin from both the mother and the father in both the 2 sites for the genetic information. And then, of course, you can have the middle ground, brown skin tone or brown gene combination here, where you would have two from one side and 2 from the other side. So we're going to take that and put it together in the classic genetic Punnett square, where we're going to assume that both the mother and the father have kind of the brown gene combination. That would be representative of the most amount of information that could be contained concerning skin tone. So that would represent then this bold M, lowercase white m, I guess, in both positions, and for the father and for the mother. So the possible combinations would be getting, okay, there's 2 positions for the mother, 2 positions for the father. So you could have both parents contributing both their genes on the dark side. So you'd have the set of 4 capital M's that would represent really the darkest skin tone. Oh, I think my battery's dying here. I can use my fingers. And then you can see going along, you could have a combination of 3 and 1, 2 and 2, 1 and 3, 0 and 4. And this shows that you can readily get 5 different skin tones out of it.
Like a primary and then a recessive gene?
Good question. No, that's a good question. I really don't know that with respect to the whole skin tone thing. Like eye color, I guess, would be an example that I'm more familiar with. Right, brown is dominant and blue is recessive. I don't have the answer to that. Anybody here have the answer? I didn't see that in the background work that I was doing for this. Yes. That's right. There's only 2 genes. Yeah. Those were what? Oh, okay. Yes. Right. So from a biblical perspective, it would seem that Adam and Eve, the original mother and father, would have this kind of genetic information in them, because you could get the whole range of skin tone from that middle pair or pairing of genes. The amazing thing is we have recent data that supports that. I didn't realize that was going to rip off all of those. I guess I might as well do all 3 of them. These are 3 different sets of twins. The one that's a cover of National Geographic, obviously, that's Marcia and Millie Biggs. They were born in 2006. They're actually a bit older than that now, but you can see the variation in the skin tone. The next set, Maria and Lucy Ulmer, they were born in 1997. That's these 2. And then these guys are more recent. Ayan and Azira. Ayan and Azira. They were born in April 2022, I think is what my note is saying. Yeah, no, that's a good question, because I've heard of stuff like that. Yeah, I mean, genetically, yes, it's the same father. I mean, they're referred to as both biracial couples. So it would be a lighter skin and a darker skin couple. Yeah, all the couples were. Yes. I'm not discounting that, but we don't want to focus on that, right? Because, yeah, that could happen. Right, but if you look though, we're India. Yeah, they're already. Yep, that's right. In fact, great comment, because that's the next slide. It's like people have done a study of like skin tone distribution, looking at, I guess, like reflectance. I guess this is a quantitative measure of it, And you can see throughout the earth along the equator, for the most part, not perfect, but for the most part, that's where you have the darker skin and you get lighter skin as you get further away, because it's known that that has a protective effect against the harmful ultraviolet radiation from the sun. And so you could even say there's like a natural selection component of things of I guess genetics occurring here. If you tie it to the biblical perspective, Genesis chapter, oh, it's right there, 10, let's think 10 or 11, talks about the dispersal of all the, I guess, originators of a lot of the nations now that form the earth. And here's some of the names and stuff kind of overlapped onto that. And so when I was growing up, they talked about the Fertile Crescent being this Middle East area, and out of that is where humans populated the earth, which actually corresponds to the biblical model. These days, though, they don't really talk about that. They talk more about out of Africa, and we're going to look at that and look at some of the genetics here. But I guess the point is you have both a natural selection piece going on with it, so a microevolutionary process occurring, as well as a migration out of that central area. And I believe the Fertile Crescent in part was named that because when you look at the archaeological data for human civilization, in that region is where you find the earliest recorded human history. And it happens to go back 4,000 years, which would align with the biblical view of this, the repopulation after the flood. Okay, the next thing I would like to look at, we'll spend kind of the remainder of the talk looking at mitochondrial DNA. So that's what the MT stands for, mitochondrial, because there's more than one type of DNA. It is different. The regular DNA that we were talking about before with the skin tone and all that, that's from the nucleus. So nuclear DNAs, they've got a little N DNA for nuclear DNA. That's the regular stuff. But the mitochondria are the energy cells located in the cytoplasm of the cell. And the mitochondria have their own DNA. It's a small subset. It's about 16,500 base pairs versus in here it's over 3 billion base pairs. So it's a small subset. It is only passed on through the mother, so it's a matriarchal line versus a patriarchal line. You can get a patriarchal line from the Y chromosome, because that's the sex chromosome XY, right? XXYY? XXXY, sorry, for that. So you can do some similar studies with that and follow that line. We're not doing that. We're trying to keep this, contained to a reasonable time frame here. And I don't know if this really is that important, but it's kind of interesting that the DNA is a ring DNA that comes out of the mitochondria. So even though it's DNA in the mitochondria, it's still DNA, and it can undergo the same kind of mutation type of stuff. It's just passed along a different way. And they think it doesn't have the same kind of selection pressure that you would have from regular nuclear DNA, because it's just a small subset, and it's within the cell, and just operates the energy machinery, or it's mostly associated with that, for having your cells live and convert energy. The ATP, ADP, biochemical reactions. So this is just a slide showing the different kinds of mutations that can occur. Really don't want to go into a lot of gory detail about it, but you can have duplications, you can have deletions, you can have insertions, substitutions, where you're changing, in this example here, just one nucleic acid on the DNA string of information. They also can occur in little packets as well. Don't want to really look at that. We want to look at just single point mutations, if you will, in this particular example. Here's a little bit more simplified or blown up version of it. So these are the nucleotide sequence. A set of 3 is what's called a codon. That codon codes for a particular amino acid, and then the order of the amino acids, in this particular case, histidine, phenylalanine, and proline, that determines the eventual protein or whatever is being made from the DNA. And there's a ton of biochemistry behind all this stuff. But essentially, this sequence here determines the amino acid sequence, and then that thing will fold into a particular 3-dimensional shape, and that structure determines its function. So what it's going to do in the cell. Oh yeah, I guess maybe the really most important point here of all this is that you have these mutations, and they can get passed along, inherited from the parents to the children. And the fact that mutations are occurring, and they are occurring over time, suggests that maybe you could kind of trace that backwards. If you started looking at people's DNA from different places around the earth, you could see some similarities, you could see some differences, and maybe those differences say something about the history of the human race. And that's what people have been doing with these genetic studies and the whole idea of we came out of Africa, so to speak. The funny thing is, though, if you think about this, even the evolutionists are assuming behind the scenes here that there was some like original form of the DNA, and it's been mutating over time, and you can kind of trace back to that original. Now, I would say the original came from Adam and Eve, how we were created, and then Noah and his children after the flood. In their case, they would not accept that, obviously, but they would have to have some kind of averaged view of the DNA of humans and then kind of cross-compare and say, well, why are these differences here? Is it because of where they live? Is it because of where they lived in time? So, where they lived in place, where they lived in time. And can we trace that back and follow the history of human evolution? Oh. Oh, what I've seen, I saw some stuff on blood types. I think I've seen something like that. I can't really speak definitively of it, though. But I think the answer is yes to that. There's been some work along those lines.
I think when they found the genome, that I heard somewhere in the news that they could only trace it back 5,000 years.
Oh, this.
Yes.
Yeah, we're actually going to talk about that, right? Now, there are some assumptions in how you interpret the data to get that conclusion, right? But yeah, we'll take a look at that. All right, this is some of the gory detail that I really want to avoid, but this is African DNA. This is actually 25 full mitochondrial DNA sequences that were analyzed. There's programs and things out there that help you do it, and people are writing papers and all this stuff on it. The point I wanted to make with this over-information kind of slide is that there are groups of genes that are similar, and then you can find by comparing what is the difference on the particular point of the DNA sequence. Where are the point mutations, and what have they changed to, and how do they compare back? So people draw these maps of the different changes and then try to classify them. You can see it's kind of a big mess. And so if you ignore a lot of all the primes and extra letters, or numbers, I guess, the big families, if you will, of genes are just the letter by itself. So there's the L branch here, if you will, and then all these sub-branches that came off of that. L3 is kind of a big one for the out of Africa people. And then over here, this is kind of the European side. You can see M, N, and R. Again, what do those specifically mean? Actually, I really don't know the details, but it's buried in the genetics here in the particular mutations that have arisen over time in those populations. I thought there was another piece coming here. This is a little more simplified. This is taking a different part of the chain. Down here was like the European thing. So if you take that and expand it, here's kind of the big letter groups of similar DNA for different places in Europe. Oh, I think this is going to go away, but I think I wanted to say something about the previous one. I'm going to go backwards. So again, these numbers that you can barely read here are specific points in the DNA of the mitochondrial DNA. There's 16,569 or something like that. And so that these numbers are the places where that occurs. Here, this mutation is at point or position 10,819. That's what all those numbers there are reflecting. So you can, but it takes something to align the sequences from different people in different places and all that, because there's some variation there. Yes. Yeah, that's one mutation. Yep, this would be 6 or whatever. Yep. Yeah, that's right. Between the two. The other thing here was, I was wondering, well, how do they, where do you get your starting point? Because when I was looking through this, depending on what people were interested in looking at, you have different people using different data sets to have a starting point. In fact, the first letters were A, B, C, D, which aren't even on either of these slides. I think it'll show up in one of the other ones. But that was people that were interested in, I guess, indigenous people in the Americas, North America. And they first started seeing some things there, and they came up with this kind of classification system of all these variations. And then other people looked at, oh, well, European thing, and that's where you got some of these other letters here. And then, oh, well, what about Africa? And then some of those letters. So it's kind of developed, in a hodgepodge kind of way. I mean, science tends to do that historically. It's not this nice, neat, linear sequence of discoveries that occur. You get it presented that way in like a textbook because you're trying to simplify it and have it make some sense. But how the information is presented in the textbook is unlikely to be anything of how it happened historically. So I say all that to say how they rooted this tree is they used 2 chimpanzee mitochondrial DNA sequences. It's like, okay, that's part of your starting assumptions. You're assuming that we came from monkeys, so you're going to get a result that we came from monkeys. So I really didn't like that, but I get it. You have to start somewhere, and given where they're coming from, or people from an evolutionary point of view, yeah, okay, that makes sense that they would start there. But they should recognize at least they've got some bias. I know I have a bias, a confirmation bias from a biblical perspective. So if you take some of this detail here and kind of map it out, this is one, I guess, common view of where things came from. And now they've got the evolutionary time frame. So this is a couple 100,000 years back, like I was saying on one of those earlier slides, according to the evolutionary time scale. And then there were migrations, and you can see these groups and kind of things breaking off and splitting off over time into the different geographical regions around the world. Now, in order, probably the one key point here, in order to get this kind of map, you have to assume that there is a constant rate of mutation. And if you do that, this kind of map will come out of all that genetic analysis. Because really what's going on is you're seeing that, oh, my thing is failing here. If you compare like this M group to this L group, you'll see whatever, 5 mutations. But if you go further away, you'll see 20 mutations. If you go further away, you'll see 50 mutations, or whatever the numbers happen to be. I actually have a little bit of an idea of that. So that's how they get this dispersal, is really by looking at the differences or the number of differences between the people, the DNA of the people from these different geographical regions, and then saying, well, if the mutation rate is constant over time, then it corresponds to these time frames with these people in these locations. So that kind of brings, I think, all that together, at least I hope. Well, what if you look at the data and don't put all that other stuff on it? What if you just look at the relative relationships apart from a map and apart from all these time sequences that have been put on there, which it's not like that's necessarily bad, but there are assumptions and things that go with that. You get a, I guess, map like this. It's not really a map. That's why I think I use the term lineages, because these are different groups of similar DNA with different people groups. And generally, this is the African mitochondrial DNA. This is European. This is Asian. A couple points could make here. One is there's a star. Where is it? Right there. That is this, it's been highlighted over here, this RCRS. That's the Revised Cambridge, oh boy, I never remember, reference sequence. There we go. That was actually put together from one European person, and they used it as a frame of reference. Just like they were using the 2 chimpanzees for a frame of reference. This is a different frame of reference. And there's some other studies that have tried to expand on this to try to help get a better picture of the, I guess, changes among the different people groups around the world. The interesting thing here, there's a couple interesting things in that you see these little arrows. Those are showing like mutations that can go either way. Because sometimes you have a mutation that you'll take whatever, guanine to alanine, but you can take alanine back to guanine. So it's like a reverse mutation. I don't know if you say it was correcting the first one, but it flipped back to where it came from. And so that's why there's some places where there's double-headed arrows. And that's partly why they drew the line like this. This is all double-headed arrow right here. So you can go back and forth along this center piece here. And when you look at the DNA genetic information from this perspective, it looks like the origins of humans is somewhere over here. It's more Eurasia than it is Africa, which aligns with the Fertile Crescent biblical history of the world. Well, there have been some people that have tried to get what you might call a consensus sequence. Can we look at more people and their DNA from all around the world and kind of like average that? What's more of a representative person in their DNA structure? And then we'll look at the differences that arise from that more representative averaged person. So Carter, whoops, I hit the wrong button again, sorry. I didn't change good. 2007, put one of these together based on 827 full mitochondrial DNA sequences. It was worldwide. And one of the things they found, and that's what this diagram is showing, is that most of the mitochondrial DNA was identical, invariant, no change between everybody on the face of the planet, 84.1%. The remaining 16%, almost half of those they call personal mutations. That is, they saw it in one person and nobody else had that mutation. And that would show up over here in this number of alleles. An allele is, like we're talking about eye color. You can have a gene that goes for brown eyes or expresses brown eyes, or one that expresses blue eyes. Those are two alleles for eye color. And so that's what they're mapping here. So most of them have one allele. That means there's no variation between it. It's all the same with everybody. Here's where you can start having some variation. You see it tails off quite a bit. One of the interesting things that comes out of using this consensus sequence is the average number of variation is 22 nucleotides across everybody, across all the planet, all the humans. So that's not much. That's 22 nucleotides out of 16,569. I should have done the math on that. Yeah, what's the percentage of that? Yeah, I can do that, but I'll let my wife do it, or maybe David can do it there. So one of the interesting things that comes out of this really lack of variation, and now this is from not a creation person, this is from evolutionary biologist paper that's proceeding the National Academy of Sciences. The observed virtual lack of sequence polymorphism, that is these differences in the DNA, is the signature of a recent single origin for modern humans with then general replacement of archaic old populations. What's that number? Point what? 0.14. Okay, so that's almost a 99.9%. That's good. There we go. Okay. I don't know why I didn't do that. I was punching a bunch of numbers before coming here and doing this just to, just see what some of these numbers look like and try to get a handle on things. So it seems like from this perspective of the mitochondrial DNA, it's suggesting that there really is a recent human origins. And it gets even better or worse depending on your perspective. This is from a science article, or maybe science letter. They were looking at this mutation rate thing that we talked about. That's an important assumption to get kind of this dispersal across the planet and the time frames and all that. Well, this is their estimated rates, and they're getting those by trying to look at like maybe some fossils out of Africa, and that's been dated at whatever, 3 million years old or 250,000 years old, whatever, that kind of thing, and looking at the DNA and then comparing it to something that's more modern and saying, okay, there's this many mutations, so it happened over this length of time, so this is the mutation rate over that time. Note that they put this in estimated, and this is like, the evolutionary people for that in pretty wide error bars. But other people went and said, well, let's just look at things that we have known timelines, more well-defined timelines, closer in history. Like, for example, Tsar Alexander and his family, I think we have DNA material from them that we can look at their genetics. We know that was 1917. And we can look at somebody from modern day. So we'll call it 100 years, 2017. And when you do that, this mutation rate goes much higher. It's a faster mutation rate, much faster. Well, when you put that into, I guess, the mathematical machinery that's calculating these times of origins and dispersal around the planet, it kind of blows that stuff up a little bit. So this is their quote: regardless of the cause, evolutionists are most concerned about the effect of a faster mutation rate. For example, researchers have calculated that mitochondrial Eve, they're even using that term, the woman whose mitochondrial DNA was ancestral to that in all living people, lived 100,000 to 200,000 years ago in Africa. Using the new clock, she would be a mere 6,000 years old. Who would have thunk? No one thinks that's the case, but at what point should models switch from one mitochondrial DNA time zone to the other? Right, yeah, if you have the evolutionary bias, which I've already acknowledged I have, a biblical whatever bias, creation bias. Yeah, so they say that can't be right. And one of the interesting things I saw as I was doing some digging on these mitochondrial clocks is I didn't look at that many, but all the recent studies that I was looking at, they are using this kind of data for their models. They're basically ignoring this, saying that data really isn't strong or any good. And I get it. I mean, in one sense, I don't fault them for that, because I do similar things when you're looking at the creation model. Some data I weigh more heavily than other data. Everybody does it. All scientists do it. All people do it. Even in making choices on, what car you want to buy, or, where do you want to go to eat tonight, or, those kinds of things. You weigh the data for various reasons in different ways. So it seems to me that the genetic information from the mitochondrial side is supporting the original biblical narrative that there really was a flood and that we were repopulated by a small group of people and repopulated the planet. There's other data that I did not put together or present here with so-called like population bottlenecks and things like that that are indicative of small populations. Like one of the articles I ran into was saying, oh, we think that all of Europe could have come from 50 people. Well, that would actually make sense with this kind of model, because by the time they started migrating that way, there would be a small group of people that would have been kind of the core starting of the population over there. And there were other things in the literature suggesting that there were a handful of people, even from this like kind of out of Africa model, that started things. You know, it was one or a few people that all of our DNA traces back to.